Cast out for failing to give her husband children, Mary never expected that her greatest blessing would come through the ancient wisdom of the North. This is the story of a woman whose worth had been measured only by her ability to bear children, and the Inuit Shaman who taught her that some gifts are revealed not through what we create with our bodies, but through what we nurture with our hearts. Mary Thompson sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the small room above the general store, listening to the sounds of family life drifting up from the apartment below. Children laughing, parents calling, the comfortable chaos of a household where new life was welcomed and celebrated. At 28, Mary had learned to find these sounds both comforting and painful, reminders of the life she had desperately wanted but had never been able to create. 3 months had passed since her husband James had finally spoken the words she had been dreading for years, the formal acknowledgement of what everyone in their small farming community had already concluded, that their childless marriage was a failure, and that Mary's inability to conceive was a burden he could no longer bear. "It's not natural, Mary," James had said during their final argument, his voice carrying the frustration and disappointment that had been building throughout their 7 years of marriage. "A woman who can't give her husband children isn't fulfilling her purpose. I need a wife who can build a family with me, not someone who just takes up space in my house." The words had cut deeply not just because of their cruelty, but because they reflected beliefs that Mary had absorbed from her community, her family, and even her own understanding of what made a woman valuable and worthy of love. She had grown up in a world where a woman's primary worth was measured by her fertility, where childless wives were viewed with a mixture of pity and suspicion, where failure to produce offspring was seen as both personal inadequacy and divine punishment for unnamed sins. For 7 years, Mary had endured the monthly cycle of hope and devastating disappointment, the well-meaning but painful advice from other women, the increasingly strained relationship with a husband who had begun to see her as a broken object rather than a beloved partner. She had consulted doctors, tried folk remedies, prayed desperately for the miracle that would transform her into the kind of wife James wanted and the kind of woman society valued. The divorce had been swift and brutal, with James claiming abandonment despite the fact that he had been the one to demand that Mary leave their home. The legal proceedings had made it clear that a childless woman had few rights and little sympathy from courts that viewed marriage primarily as an arrangement for producing legitimate heirs. Mary had been left with minimal financial support and no clear path forward in a society that had no recognized role for women who failed to become mothers. The small room above the general store represented the only housing Mary could afford on the meager wages she earned doing piecework sewing for other families. The irony was not lost that she spent her days creating clothing for children she would never have, mending tiny garments and crafting beautiful items for babies she would never hold. But the work provided barely enough income to pay for rent and basic necessities. And Mary knew that her current situation was neither sustainable nor satisfying as a long-term solution to her circumstances. What made Mary's situation even more difficult was a social isolation that accompanied her changed status in the community. Married women who had once considered her a friend now seemed uncomfortable around her, perhaps fearing that her condition might be contagious or simply unsure how to relate to someone whose life had taken such a different path from their own. Single women viewed her with suspicion as potential competition for the limited number of eligible men, despite Mary's complete lack of interest in romantic relationships after the devastation of her divorce. The children in the community, who had once called her Aunt Mary and sought her out for stories and small kindnesses, were now kept at distance by parents who seemed to believe that her childlessness indicated some moral failing that made her unsuitable company for young people. The loss of these relationships was perhaps the most painful aspect of Mary's new circumstances, as she had always found great joy in nurturing and teaching children, even when she could not have her own. But perhaps the most crushing burden Mary carried was the internalized belief that her inability to conceive represented a fundamental flaw in her character or spirit, that she was somehow being punished for sins she could not identify, or weaknesses she could not overcome. The religious teachings of her community emphasized that children were blessings from God, which seemed to imply that her childlessness reflected divine disapproval or abandonment. Perhaps this is God's way of telling you that you weren't meant to be a mother, her own sister has suggested during one of their increasingly rare conversations. Maybe you should accept that your path in life is different from other women's and try to find peace with that reality. The advice, though well-intentioned, only reinforced Mary's growing sense that she was fundamentally different from other women in ways that made her less valuable and less worthy of love and companionship. She had begun to see herself as broken, cursed, doomed to a life of loneliness and purposelessness because she could not fulfill what society considered her primary function as a woman. The decision that would ultimately transform everything about Mary's understanding of herself and her possibilities came not from careful planning or spiritual revelation, but from a practical opportunity that offered escape from circumstances that had become increasingly unbearable. The territorial government had posted notices seeking teachers willing to relocate to remote communities that lacked access to formal education, and Mary found herself seriously considering applications for positions that would take her far from the judgment and pity of people who knew her story. "Are you certain this is wise, Mary?" Mrs. Patterson, the store owner's wife, asked when Mary mentioned her intentions. "Those settlements are primitive, dangerous places full of heathens and rough men. A woman alone, especially a woman in your situation, might find herself in circumstances even worse than what you're leaving behind." The warnings were probably well-intentioned, but they also revealed assumptions about Mary's vulnerability and limited options that made her more determined than ever to pursue opportunities that might offer genuine independence and purpose. She had spent months feeling like a burden and a failure in her familiar community, and the possibility of starting fresh somewhere that her history was unknown seemed worth almost any risk. The teaching position Mary ultimately accepted was in one of the most remote settlements in the Northern Territories, a community that included both white traders and indigenous families who had established cooperative relationships for mutual benefit during the challenging seasons of Arctic survival. The job would require her to teach children from diverse cultural backgrounds using limited resources, but it also offered housing, decent wages, and the opportunity to contribute something valuable to a community that desperately needed her skills. The journey to her new home was long and increasingly challenging as she traveled farther from civilization into landscapes that seemed untouched by human presence. The final portion of her trip was completed by dog sled, driven by a mail carrier who made the dangerous journey between settlements several times each year carrying supplies and communications. "You sure about this, miss?" the driver asked as they approached their destination. "Winter's coming on fast, and once the trails close, you'll be stuck until spring thaw. If you change your mind about staying, this might be your last chance to head back to civilization." Mary appreciated the concern, but she had made her decision based on careful consideration of her alternatives rather than romantic notions about frontier life. She had nowhere to return to, no relationships or opportunities that would provide security or satisfaction in the communities she was leaving behind. Whatever challenges awaited her in the Arctic settlement could hardly be worse than the social rejection and personal despair she had been experiencing. The community that became Mary's new home was unlike anything she had previously experienced, a place where survival and cooperation were more important than social hierarchies based on marriage status, reproductive history, or conformity to conventional gender roles. The settlement included families from various backgrounds who had learned to work together to meet the challenges of living in one of the most demanding environments on Earth, creating a culture that valued practical contributions over adherence to abstract social expectations. Mary's arrival was welcomed not just because the community needed a teacher, but because educated women were rare and valuable resources whose skills could benefit everyone in multiple ways. Her ability to teach children, help adults with literacy and numeracy, assist with record keeping and correspondence, and provide medical care based on her knowledge of health and hygiene made her immediately useful in ways that had nothing to do with her marital status or reproductive capacity. But perhaps most significantly, Mary discovered that her childlessness was viewed very differently by the indigenous families in the settlement than it had been by her previous community. Rather than seeing her condition as evidence of divine punishment or personal inadequacy, the Inuit family seemed to understand that some women were meant to serve their communities in different ways than biological motherhood, that there were various forms of nurturing and spiritual contribution that were equally valuable and necessary. The person who would ultimately transform Mary's understanding of her own worth and potential was someone she initially approached with curiosity rather than expectations of personal revelation. Tunu was the settlement's traditional healer, a man whose knowledge of medicinal plants, spiritual practices, and healing techniques made him invaluable to both indigenous and non-indigenous community members who faced illness or injury in an environment where formal medical care was non-existent. Tuna was unlike anyone Mary had ever met, a person whose presence seemed to radiate calm wisdom and deep understanding of human nature in all its complexity. In his mid-40s, he possessed the kind of quiet authority that came from years of helping people through their most difficult and vulnerable moments, combined with genuine humility about the limits of his knowledge and the mysteries that remained beyond human comprehension. Mary's first encounter with Tunu came when she sought his help treating a student who had developed a persistent cough that was interfering with her ability to concentrate in school. Western medicine, as Mary understood it, had little to offer for such conditions, but she had heard that traditional remedies might be more effective for ailments that seemed to have both physical and emotional components. "You are the new teacher," Tunu observed when Mary approached him with her request. "The one who came from the south to help our children learn new ways of understanding the world." "Yes," Mary replied, somewhat surprised by his directness. "I'm hoping you might be able to help Anna with her cough. The usual remedies don't seem to be helping, and I wondered if traditional medicines might be more effective." Tunu studied Mary's face with the kind of patient attention that made her feel as though he was seeing more than just her immediate request. "I will certainly help the child," he said. "But I think perhaps you have come to me for reasons beyond her cough. There is sadness in your spirit that speaks of wounds deeper than physical illness." The observation was so unexpected and accurate that Mary felt tears welling in her eyes before she could compose herself to respond appropriately. "I don't know what you mean," Mary said, falling back on the defensive responses she had developed during months of deflecting well-meaning but painful inquiries about her circumstances. "In my culture," Tunu said gently, "we believe that all forms of suffering have purpose, that the spirits never burden someone with challenges they are not strong enough to bear. But sometimes we need help understanding what our particular struggles are meant to teach us, and how our experiences of pain can become sources of wisdom that serve our communities." The philosophical framework was completely foreign to Mary's understanding of suffering as punishment or evidence of personal inadequacy. The idea that her childlessness and social rejection might have purpose beyond simple misfortune was both intriguing and difficult to accept after years of viewing her circumstances as proof of her failure as a woman. Over the following weeks, as Mary worked with Tunu to address various health concerns among her students, she found herself drawn into conversations about healing, purpose, and the different ways that individuals could serve their communities. Tunu's approach to medicine emphasized understanding people as complete beings whose physical, emotional, and spiritual health were interconnected, rather than treating symptoms in isolation from broader life circumstances. "In Western medicine, you try to fix what is broken," Tunu explained, as he prepared herbal treatments for several community members. "In traditional medicine, we try to understand why someone became unbalanced and how to restore harmony between all aspects of their being. Sometimes what appears to be sickness is actually the spirit's way of preparing someone for a different kind of service."
The conversation took place while they worked together gathering medicinal plants, and Mary found herself sharing details about her background and circumstances that she had not intended to reveal.
But Tunu's non-judgmental attention and genuine interest in understanding her experience created a safe space for honesty about struggles she had been keeping carefully hidden. "I was married for 7 years without conceiving a child," Mary found herself saying as they worked. "My husband divorced me, my community rejected me, and I came here because I had nowhere else to go. Everyone believes I'm cursed or broken somehow, and I suppose I've begun to believe it too." Tunu's response challenged every assumption Mary had made about her circumstances and their meaning. "Among my people, women who do not bear children are often called to be healers, teachers, or spiritual guides," he said. "We believe that some spirits are meant to mother entire communities rather than individual families, that their energy and attention are not divided by the demands of raising their own children because they are needed to nurture everyone's children." The concept was so foreign to Mary's experience that she initially struggled to understand what Tunu was suggesting. But surely having children is what makes a woman complete, what gives her life meaning and purpose. "Having children makes some women complete," Tunu corrected gently, "but other women are complete in different ways, through different forms of creation and nurturing. You teach children who are not your biological offspring, but you still mother them by helping them grow and learn. You care for 6 students as though they were your own family. You have already begun to understand the kind of motherhood that was always meant to be yours." The observation forced Mary to reconsider everything she thought she knew about her own identity and value. Throughout her years of struggle with infertility, she had focused exclusively on what she could not do, rather than recognizing what she was already accomplishing through her relationships with other people's children and her contributions to community welfare. As winter deepened and Mary became more integrated into the settlement's daily life, she began to observe how Tunu's philosophy about different forms of service was reflected in the community's social organization. Rather than viewing childless adults as incomplete or unsuccessful, the community seemed to recognize various ways that individuals could contribute to collective welfare and the nurturing of the next generation. Aput, an elderly Inuit woman who had never married or had children, was one of the most respected members of the community because of her skills as a storyteller and keeper of traditional knowledge. Her contribution to the cultural education of young people was considered as valuable as any biological parent's role in their development. Similarly, several unmarried men in the community were valued as teachers, protectors, and mentors, whose energy and attention were available to serve all families, rather than being focused on their own immediate relatives. "Our children belong to the entire community," Apwood explained to Mary during one of their conversations about traditional child-rearing practices.
"Every adult has responsibility for their welfare and development. Some of us contribute through bearing and raising our own children, others through teaching, healing, protecting, or providing for the children of others. All forms of service are necessary and honored." The philosophy represented a complete reversal of everything Mary had been taught about family, motherhood, and women's roles in society. Instead of viewing childlessness as failure or incompleteness, this community understood it as a different form of contribution that was equally valuable and necessary for collective welfare. But the transformation in Mary's understanding of her own worth and purpose required more than intellectual acceptance of new ideas. It required healing the emotional wounds that years of rejection and self-criticism had created. This deeper healing came through her growing relationship with Tunu, who seemed to understand not just her circumstances, but the particular ways that social rejection had damaged her sense of self-worth. "You have been taught that your value comes from your ability to produce children," Tunu told her during one of their regular conversations about healing and spiritual growth. "But value comes from the love you give, the wisdom you share, the comfort you provide to those who suffer. These gifts have nothing to do with biological fertility and everything to do with spiritual abundance." The distinction between biological and spiritual fertility was one that Mary had never considered, but it provided a framework for understanding her own capabilities and contributions in ways that affirmed rather than diminished her sense of purpose.
she began to recognize that her natural empathy, her patience with children, her ability to nurture learning and growth were forms of mothering that were genuinely valuable even though they did not produce biological offspring. The healing process was gradual and sometimes difficult, as Mary worked through years of internalized beliefs about her own inadequacy and worthlessness. But Tunu's patient guidance and the community's acceptance of her contributions provided a supportive environment where she could explore new ways of understanding herself and her place in the world. The breakthrough that marked Mary's complete transformation came when she was asked to help a family whose young daughter was struggling with traumatic grief after losing her mother in an accident. The child had withdrawn from social contact, stopped eating properly, and was showing signs of the kind of deep depression that could prove fatal if not addressed with skill and compassion. Working with Tunu, Mary developed approaches to helping the girl that combined traditional healing practices with educational techniques and emotional support. The process required patient, consistent attention over many weeks, but gradually the child began to emerge from her isolation and engage with life again. Watching the girl's recovery and knowing that she had played a crucial role in saving a young life gave Mary a sense of purposefulness and maternal satisfaction that she had never experienced during her years of trying to conceive. You see, Tunu observed as they watched the child playing happily with other children after weeks of withdrawn silence. You have been a mother to her in ways that her biological mother never could be, because you have the experience of healing deep wounds that comes from your own suffering. Your childlessness was preparation for this kind of mothering, not evidence of your failure to mother. The insight represented a complete transformation in Mary's understanding of her own story and its meaning. Instead of viewing her inability to conceive as punishment or inadequacy, she began to see it as preparation for a different kind of maternal calling that required specific experiences and capabilities that she had developed through her struggles. The success of her work with the grieving child led to other opportunities to use her nurturing capabilities in service of community welfare. Mary became known as someone who could work effectively with children who were facing various forms of trauma, loss, or behavioral challenges, developing approaches that combined her educational training with insights gained from traditional healing practices. But perhaps more importantly, Mary's transformation from despair to purposefulness provided an example for other community members who were struggling with their own sense of inadequacy or social rejection. Her story demonstrated that apparent failures or disappointment could be reframed as preparation for forms of service that might not be immediately obvious but were ultimately more fulfilling than conventional success. The romantic relationship that developed between Mary and Tunu grew naturally from their shared work and mutual respect, rather than from desperate need or social expectations. "I want to be clear about what I am offering and what I am asking," Tunu told Mary when he formally expressed his romantic interest. "I am not seeking a wife to bear my children or to serve my domestic needs. I am hoping to find a partner who shares my commitment to healing and serving others. Someone whose own spiritual gifts complement my own so that we can do better work together than either of us could accomplish alone." The proposal represented exactly the kind of relationship Mary had never known existed. Partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than traditional gender roles or social expectations about marriage and family. Tuna was offering her a recognition of her spiritual gifts, an invitation to use them in service of their community, rather than viewing her as incomplete because she could not bear children. Their marriage ceremony incorporated both traditional Inuit practices and Christian elements, creating a celebration that honored both their cultural backgrounds while establishing their commitment to a shared future of service and healing. The community's enthusiastic support for their union demonstrated how completely Mary had been accepted as a valuable member of the settlement whose contributions were recognized and appreciated. The years that followed Mary's marriage brought challenges and rewards that confirmed her transformation from rejected and purposeless woman to respected healer and spiritual guide. Working alongside Tunu, she developed skills in traditional healing practices while contributing her own knowledge of education, healthcare, and emotional support to their shared practice. But perhaps most significantly, Mary and Tunu became known throughout the region as healers who specialized in helping people who were struggling with issues related to fertility, childlessness, and alternative forms of family creation. Their own story provided hope and guidance for couples who were facing similar challenges, demonstrating that fulfillment and purpose could be found through various paths rather than only through biological reproduction. "They saved our marriage," wrote one couple who had consulted Mary and Tunu after years of struggling with infertility. "They helped us understand that our love for each other was complete even without children, and that we could find ways to contribute to our community's welfare that were just as valuable as raising our own family." The work became one of the most satisfying aspects of Mary's new life, as she was able to use her own experience of healing and transformation to help others who were facing similar struggles. Her understanding of the pain caused by social rejection and internalized inadequacy, combined with her discovery of alternative sources of purpose and fulfillment, made her uniquely qualified to guide other people through similar transitions. The community that had welcomed Mary as a teacher gradually recognized her as one of their most valuable spiritual and emotional resources, someone whose combination of traditional healing knowledge and personal experience with transformation made her effective at helping people through various forms of crisis and transition.
The children who had been her students grew up to become successful adults who credited Mary's influence with helping them develop confidence, resilience, and understanding of their own potential. Many returned to visit her years later, bringing their own children to meet the woman who had served as a spiritual mother to multiple generations of young people. "You taught us that family is bigger than blood relationships," one former student told Mary during a visit with her own children. "You showed us that love and nurturing can come from many sources, that we should value all the adults who help us grow and learn rather than only focusing on our biological parents." The observation reflected one of the most important lessons of Mary's transformation, that traditional concepts of family and parenthood were limiting and incomplete, that human communities thrived when they recognized and utilized all forms of nurturing and spiritual contribution, rather than only valuing biological reproduction. As Mary entered her 40s, still actively involved in healing work despite her advancing age, she often reflected on the journey that had brought her from despair and social rejection to fulfillment and respected service. The woman who had once believed she was cursed and worthless because she could not bear children had discovered that her apparent limitation had actually been preparation for a different and ultimately more satisfying form of motherhood. The community she had found in the Arctic settlement had taught her that human worth was not determined by reproductive capacity, but by character, compassion, and willingness to serve others. More importantly, she had learned that apparent failures or disappointments could be transformed into sources of wisdom and strength that enabled forms of contribution that might not have been possible through more conventional paths. The partnership she had built with Tunu had demonstrated that marriage could be based on shared spiritual purpose, rather than social expectations or biological imperatives. Their relationship had grown stronger over the years as they worked together to heal and guide others, proving that true compatibility was based on values and vision, rather than conventional romantic attraction or family building goals. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Mary's transformation was the way it had influenced broader community attitudes about childlessness, alternative family structures, and women's roles in society. Her example had helped establish acceptance for various forms of spiritual and social contribution, creating space for other people who might not fit traditional patterns of family and reproduction. The children who grew up in her community understood from early ages that adults could contribute to their welfare and development in multiple ways, that biological relationships were important, but not the only source of love and guidance they would receive.
This understanding prepared them to create more inclusive and flexible approaches to family and community in their own adult lives.
The healing practices that Mary and Tunu had developed became models for other communities throughout the region, as their success in helping people with fertility challenges and family creation became known among networks of healers and spiritual guides. Their approach, which combined traditional indigenous wisdom with compassionate understanding of modern social pressures, provided effective support for people who were struggling with issues that conventional medicine and religious guidance often failed to address adequately. You proved that healing comes in many forms, a visiting healer told Mary during a conference of traditional practitioners. You showed that sometimes the greatest gift we can offer is helping people understand that their limitations are actually preparations for different forms of service. As Mary approached her 50th birthday, she was recognized not just within her own community, but throughout the Northern Territories as one of the most skilled and respected healers of her generation. The woman who had once felt cursed and worthless had become a source of wisdom and guidance for countless people who were facing their own struggles with social acceptance and personal fulfillment. The legacy she was creating extended far beyond her individual healing work to influence how entire communities understood family, motherhood, and human worth. Her story had become part of the oral tradition among both indigenous and settler communities, passed down as an example of how apparent limitations could be transformed into sources of strength and service. The greatest blessing that Mary had discovered through her journey from rejection to acceptance was not the biological children she had once desperately wanted, but the spiritual children whose lives she had touched through her teaching, healing, and guidance. The community that had become her family was larger and more diverse than any traditional household, including people of all ages who had been influenced by her wisdom and compassion. I understand now that I was never meant to be a mother in the conventional sense, Mary reflected during a conversation with a young woman who was struggling with similar issues. I was meant to be a spiritual mother to people who needed healing, guidance, and acceptance that they couldn't find elsewhere. My childlessness was not a curse. It was preparation for a blessing I never could have imagined. Cast out for failing to give her husband children, Mary had indeed found her greatest blessing through the ancient wisdom of the North, discovering that true motherhood was measured not by biological fertility, but by the depth of love, wisdom, and healing that one could offer to others. The woman who had once been considered cursed had become a source of blessing for everyone whose life she touched, proving that the spirits indeed work in mysterious ways to prepare people for the service they were always meant to provide.